It's a very, very complicated plan, as you know. It started out 3.5 pages long. The legislation that was finally adopted and signed by the president had 400 pages. So it's a very, very complicated plan with many different elements. As I see it, there are two basic elements. One is the idea of trying to rectify the financial arrangements that led to the subprime lending crisis. That's something that's quite unique to the United States. There are real estate booms all over the world, in the UK, in Ireland, in Spain, in Hong Kong, and so on. But the United States is the only country in which subprime lending, in other words, lending to people who really couldn't qualify on the basis of financial standards for loans to buy real estate, were allowed to buy real estate and get loans through the so-called subprime lending. That's something that then generated a whole financial industry of people who were trying to figure out some way to reduce the very substantial risk that this entailed by developing new financial instruments, selling to new bearers of risk, and hopefully compensating them and so on. The whole thing, of course, ended up in a disaster. So this is something that the Paulson plan would remedy by trying to have the government intervene in the markets for all of these different kinds of securities, establishing prices that then would enable the financial institutions to meet the requirements for their financial viability by appropriate repricing of all these assets and eliminating these assets and replacing them hopefully by safer and less risky assets. So that is a central part of the plan. I think that's something unique to the United States. It poses problems for the rest of the world because of the fact that American institutions, financial institutions, are so deeply intertwined with financial institutions around the world. But nonetheless, the root problem is unique to the United States, and by dealing with this problem, it's going to be possible to alleviate some of the difficulties that have arisen. The second part of the problem, again, is specific to the United States in the sense that as a result of subprime lending, the securitization, and so on, many financial institutions are now undercapitalized, some of them very severely undercapitalized, the ones that have gone broke. For example, major investment banks like Bear Stearns and Lehman and Merrill Lynch have all given up their independent identity, been acquired, or in the case of Lehman, were allowed to go bankrupt. That is something that the government is going to deal with by equity investments in these financial institutions that are very familiar to Europeans and Latin Americans. Governments have quite commonly engaged in equity investments in order to increase the capital base for these financial institutions in their own countries. The way that that will work out will be specific to the United States, but it certainly should lead to a more stable financial system. So overall, I'm in favor of the Paulson plan. I think that it does try to deal with the root cause, the subprime lending crisis, and it does attempt to recapitalize the financial institutions which have been severely stressed by this financial crisis. But I don't want to leave this subject without emphasizing a very important fact, and that is that the problems of the U.S. economy are far more serious than the subprime lending crisis. For example, the United States has been borrowing abroad now in large quantities for about 30 years and has accumulated a huge international debt, which is not sustainable. That's something that's going to have to be reversed, and there's nothing in the Paulson plan that deals with that problem at all. There is a severe problem in the real estate sector. The real estate sector in the United States is a very important part of the economy, not as large as in Spain to be sure, but nonetheless a very important part of the economy. And the real estate sector is going to have to contract. Another issue that is dealt with, but only indirectly by the Paulson plan, is that as a result of the financial crisis and the crisis that preceded it, I referred to that earlier as the dot-com crisis, we have had a bloated financial sector. We've had a tremendous flow of resources into the financial sector, far in excess of what could be permanently sustained. I estimate that the financial sector will have to contract by a factor of 2. People who are more moderate than I am in their views think that the financial sector will have to contract by 20%. But there's no doubt that the financial sector is going to be permanently smaller, and that is going to be a very painful adjustment process to reduce the size of the financial sector. So Paulson is a good beginning because it deals with the immediate problems. But unfortunately, there are long-term problems that also need to be addressed. We have a very peculiar situation in the United States. We have a situation where until 1999, we had 2 separate banking systems. One banking system was based on investment banking associated with issuing securities and raising money in the form of both debt and equity for business firms. And the other was the commercial banking sector, which was dealing with retail banking and small business loans and personal loans and so on. The barrier between these 2 kinds of banking goes back to the 1930s and was repealed in 1999. So we made a very, very important change. We allowed institutions that had previously been barred from commercial banking to enter commercial banking, and institutions that had previously been barred from investment banking to enter investment banking. The result of that was that we had an unregulated sector, namely in the investment banks, and a regulated sector, the commercial banks. The regulation of commercial banks has been pretty satisfactory. We've had a lot of difficulty, there's no doubt about that, associated with mortgage lending mainly. But the unregulated sector of the investment banks was a severe error in the process of this legislation that led to the repeal. And so what we were trying to accomplish is what European countries have accomplished many years before, namely universal banking, including both investment and commercial banking. But what we achieved was much more limited. We still had specialized institutions and unfortunately unregulated investment banks. It proved to be the case that in the stress associated with subprime lending and the securitization of subprime lending, that these institutions undertook much more risk than was appropriate. And therefore, there was a regulatory failure associated with the fact that these investment banks were allowed to be unregulated. All the major financial problems associated with the crisis that we're now in are associated with this failure in regulation. In terms of future regulation, we have to move either in the direction of separating the 2 again, which I don't think makes a great deal of sense, or in the direction of a universal banking system with universal banking regulations like you have in Europe. And so that's the direction that things have to go. The complication is associated with what I mentioned a moment ago, namely that the financial sector is now overexpanded, has far more capacity than is required, and so we're going to have to achieve this change in regulation as the industry is shrinking. That's going to be a very, very difficult thing to do in a democracy where there are interests which are trying to defend established positions that unfortunately will not have to survive in the long run. So the answer is that regulation was defective. It's clear the direction that re-regulation has to go, and the issue that we need to face, though, is that the financial sector is overexpanded and the regulations have to be adapted to reflect that fact.